Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to be with you here today to present the second keynote in the symposium. I want to start by thanking Dr. Muhammad Fakri Zaki and the rest of the organizing committee for the kind invitation to be with you here today. I'm delighted to be here. Let me start by sharing my presentation. Okay. So, my talk today will focus on issues of assessing the quality of works of research, scholarship, and creative activities in schools of architecture. The presentation will be based on a white paper prepared by the Research and Scholarship Committee of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, ACSA. The work was done in 2018 and 2019, and the white paper was published in mid-2019. The white paper was prepared by a committee of experts with 8 faculty from across the US. I had the pleasure of chairing the committee and leading the writing of the white paper. Before I start talking about the issue of assessment, though, I wanted to spend a few minutes describing the underlying issues or some of the underlying issues that the committee had to deal with. So first, I wanted to quickly talk about architecture research. And as I'm sure all of you know, architecture research is a relatively new focus for architecture faculty, for architecture schools, and for the profession at large. Although I think we can agree that it is an area that is experiencing a very rapid growth, and there's a lot more interest both in the discipline and the profession in architecture research. However, there is sometimes a misconception that I wanted to address, that misconception that there is somehow a conflict between a focus on architecture research and a focus on design, with design being the primary focus in both our discipline and our profession for very good reasons. I think this misconception, to a large degree, hurts architecture research, and I'm going to start by trying to address it as briefly as possible. So the slide you have before you right now is out of a webinar organized by ACSA in collaboration with the editorial board of the Technology, Architecture, and Design Journal. The webinar took place a couple of years ago. I think it makes a very good case for the symbiotic relationship between research and design. It captures some of the characteristics of architecture research and how it is meant to be a continuing and ever-evolving process of discovery that forms a basis for making more informed design decisions. And as such, it actually enhances design culture in schools and in firms. The slide also argues for the importance of architectural researchers having a design background. This way, they have the sensitivity needed, they have the understanding of the context and of the impact of architecture on our communities. At the same time, they also need to have expertise in developing effective research studies. Architectural research, however, comes with a lot of complexities. Part of that is because of the wide range of topics and scales that it can address. As you can see in this slide, which is a diagram developed by the American Institute of Architecture, the diagram identifies the range of scales and topics that architecture research can deal with. So you can conduct architecture research at the occupant scale, dealing with individual and human-centered issues. You can conduct architecture research at the building scale, and there are a number of perspectives and approaches and topics that you can use at that scale. And then you can also conduct architecture research at the societal scale, dealing with issues of economy, equity, environment, and related issues. And this is not an exhaustive list. You can also have architectural research dealing with design process, with governance, with policy, with urban design, and many other issues. In fact, you can argue that architectural research draws from almost the entire spectrum of human knowledge, including the arts, humanities, social sciences, engineering, applied sciences, and sometimes even basic science. That complexity of architecture research continues and even is multiplied if we look at it from the point of view of methodology. So, and again, architecture research can and does span the entire spectrum of research methods that other disciplines use. Architecture research can use purely quantitative methods all the way to purely qualitative methods, and certainly can also utilize mixed methods which combine both quantitative and qualitative. You can do historical architecture research, you can use correlational methods, you can do experimental architecture research, quasi-experimental architecture research, you can use simulation, and many other methods. So this complexity of topics and of methods do present unique challenges to the issue of assessing the quality of research products in schools of architecture that most other disciplines do not need to deal with. It, however, also makes our schools a lot richer and allows us to do a lot more than other disciplines can. So in my current position as Associate Dean, I deal with that pretty much every day. I have colleagues in my school that do completely different work, and it would be completely unfair to them and unfair to the school if all of their work is looked at through the same lens. Another challenge that architecture research also faces is the fact that it is, as I mentioned before, still relatively new in our discipline. And therefore, we still don't have the large body of knowledge and of traditions that many other disciplines have. I would argue that part of what we need to move from the left side of the screen, the current conditions where we have too few publications, too few interactions between academia and the profession, to the right side of the screen, where we would like to be, where we have a lot more research work, many more publications, many more points of interaction, and many more architects, practitioners, and academics working together to get from where we are now to where we want to be. One of the things that we need to do is to develop more rigorous and objective disciplinary norms for assessing the quality of architecture research products. When we do so, we can make sure that architecture research can grow and evolve in the right way, in the right directions. This was the starting point for our work in the committee. This was what the ACSA board charged us to do. So as I mentioned before, our committee included 8 expert faculty members from across the US with different expertise, different interests. Our objectives were the ones that you see on this slide: to review existing approaches for assessing the quality of architecture research, to review tenure and promotion policies in US schools, schools of architecture and institutions in general with regard to how do they address this issue, and also to look at other frameworks from outside the US, and finally to identify any existing challenges, constraints, and barriers in this area. As a starting point, and to address the issue of the different types of faculty that almost all schools of architecture have, we decided to build on a previous study done by the same committee a couple of years before, in which they identified different modes of production in schools of architecture. That report, and you can see a link to the report on the screen, that report identified 5 modes of production that architecture faculty typically use: curation, funding, practice recognition, publication, and public presentations. You notice that they are ordered alphabetically to avoid any perception of preference, because I think that the premise was that each one of those offers values, and it's very difficult to compare them to each other. Our committee accepted this classification as a starting point, but decided to add a sixth mode of production, which we felt was critically important. We also saw that it is increasing in use and in significance within our discipline. That sixth mode of production is community engagement. So our approach was, instead of thinking of a one-size-fits-all approach, we decided as a first step to look at each one of these six modes and to explore how they are assessed, both in architecture and in related disciplines, and then how do we think they could and should be assessed in the future. I will now quickly walk you through what we found. We started with curation, which we defined as the selection, organization, and public presentation of material. Curation has a long history in our discipline, as well as in related disciplines such as art and art history. And here we combine curating exhibits of one's own work, curating exhibits of other people's work, publishing of catalogs, papers, or other products out of exhibits, as well as organizing, chairing symposia, conferences, workshops, and similar events. So in general, our review found that standards of assessing such products in both architecture and related disciplines are typically based on external measures of excellence. For example, this could include the prominence of the venue, the prominence of the event itself, the entity organizing the event, concurrent or subsequent peer recognition of the work. Although here, the issue of in-group bias needs to be considered and avoided. If we move on to funding, and again, funding is a valuable product. However, we approached it from the point of view of funding being an enabler for the faculty member to increase the scope and impact of their work. So funding not as a means, not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. We did recognize two limitations. The first was that sources of external funding for architecture faculty are relatively limited and are certainly far fewer than those which exist in other disciplines. And the second is that architecture faculty do not necessarily have the skills needed to acquire funding. And acquiring funding does require a specific set of skills. So if we wanted architecture faculty to pursue external funding, we really need to provide them with additional training and development in this area. Having said that, we actually did a survey of funded research projects in schools of architecture and found that, as you can see in the graph before you, architecture faculty can be successful in getting funding in almost all areas of interest within schools of architecture. You probably have a higher likelihood if your work relates to an area in which there are more funding sources available, like sustainability, urban design, building systems. But even if your work is in architecture theory, in practice, human experiences, you can still be successful in acquiring external funding. Our white paper distinguished between internal and external funding. Most US universities have opportunities for internal funding that are available to faculty that are less competitive. However, they are almost invariably perceived by the university as a source of seed funds that faculty members should use to then go after and acquire larger sources of external funding. So internal funding should not be considered, again, as an end in itself, because that is not really how universities see it. With regard to funding sources, we explored a range of funding sources, again, available to faculty in US institutions. These range from federal sources, which are highly competitive, all the way down to regional and local sources, which are a lot less competitive, although probably also offering lower visibility and recognition. However, we've also noted that using local and regional funding, which again is easier to get, could be a stepping stone towards larger and more competitive forms of funding. So a faculty member could go after local and regional funding, use that as a means of enabling and supporting their work, pushing it forward, and then using the outcomes of that to pursue larger federal sources, which are inherently more difficult and offer a much lower success rate. For federal sources of fund, we also suggested that collaborating with other disciplines could be a good approach for architecture faculty to increase the likelihood of achieving these grants. Again, I want to stress again that our white paper specifically states that going after external funding sources should not be considered as an end in itself, but should be considered only as a means to an end. Funding is a tool that enables faculty to have more resources, to explore more complex projects, and to increase the impact of their work, and we should treat it as such. We also stress the importance of schools offering the needed support and training and development to the faculty who wish to explore external funding opportunities so that they can increase their success rate. So moving to the third mode of production that our white paper discussed, and this is practice recognition. And here we recognize the challenges faced by faculty who desire to use their architectural practice as an academic product. And that was actually one of the topics that took a lot of discussion from the committee. The outcome of that discussion, I think we all agreed to that. For a variety of reasons, we agreed that design practice in itself cannot be acknowledged and evaluated at the academic context. We did, however, agree that there are numerous opportunities offered by architectural practice for faculty who do practice to use their design practice as opportunities for dissemination through publications, through exhibits. These publications and exhibits can then be evaluated under their respective modes of production. We also agreed that recognition of design work through design competitions, through awards, through being published about, faculty members' design work being published about by others, and similar activities, all of that could be considered as evidence of impact depending on its level, and certainly that could count as an academic achievement. We also discussed some more innovative measures of impact through social media, perhaps, or other venues or other tools. However, at the point of writing the white paper, at least, we did not feel that any of them showed enough maturity to be utilized at a larger scale. So the diagram before you, which is also included in our white paper, gives you somewhat of an overview of the different activities that a faculty member engaged in architectural practice can use to have their work recognized academically. Some of those are based on the direct design outcome, again, like competitions, like awards, exhibits, somebody writing about you, while others would require an additional product. And the preference here, again, this respect, is the notion of peer review. So if we move on to publications, which are arguably one of the most advanced modes of production academically, whether we are talking about books, journals, conference proceedings, or other forms of publications. Here we still found that the peer review model, more specifically, the blind peer review model, is the best model to use to guarantee objectivity and avoid bias. We have, however, also recognized that the number of outlets available for architecture faculty still lags well behind other disciplines, and argued for the need for increasing those outlets, adding more high quality, rigorous dissemination outlets specifically for architecture. We also recognize that some forms of architecture publications, such as opinion essays, for example, do not lend themselves to the peer review model. And here we argued for developing additional measures of impact and of value that allow for the inclusion of such non-traditional work. This would also address the fact that architecture publications generally do not fare well when evaluated using traditional impact metrics in academic publications, such as journal impact factors. There are a lot of reasons for that that are not necessarily related to the publications themselves, but more to how this information is collected and analyzed by the entities that generate these impact factors. However, again, whatever metrics for value and impact we can use should strive for objectivity and should try as best as possible to avoid the possibility of in-group bias. Moving on to the fifth mode of production that our committee dealt with, which is public presentation. And here we included a wide range of forms of presentations, including presenting keynote speeches in conferences and symposia, like I'm doing with you today, presenting peer-reviewed work in conferences, invited lectures and presentations in other schools, poster presentations in conferences, and other similar types of activities. Again, we recognize that public presentations are an established form of dissemination in architecture and in other disciplines as well, and they could and should signify a level of peer recognition and respect depending on the level of the presentation. We identified several measures, however, that could be used in evaluating public presentations, such as peer review, quality and scale of event, and the host organization. And again, we talked about potential impact. How do we measure the potential impact of that presentation? There was one type of presentation that we discussed, which is serving as a jury member or a guest critic in studio reviews and other institutions. And here we, again, almost all of us agreed that these types of activities should not be considered as research or scholarship and should instead be considered as a contribution to a faculty member's teaching activities. So to move to the last mode of production that we addressed, which is community engagement. Again, this was the mode of production that we added to our white paper, which was not included in the previous report from the committee. But again, we felt it was a very important mode of production. It's one that is growing in use and becoming increasingly important activity for faculty in U.S. schools of architecture and actually in U.S. institutions in general. Here we argued for engagement to be considered as a form of scholarship. So scholarship of engagement is a topic that is being widely discussed right now. Strangely enough, this is not a new concept. It's what Ernest Boyer argued for in 1990, so more than 30 years ago. How to recognize community engagement is an ongoing discussion in many U.S. universities, and not just in relation to architecture, but other disciplines as well. So we are not alone in trying to have our community engagement work recognized as scholarship. Other disciplines are making the same argument. The trend that I can see is clearly moving towards some form of recognition of the scholarship of engagement. However, I have to admit that some obstacles still remain to be overcome in this area in U.S. institutions. Some have gone further than others. So our white paper argued for more effort in documenting possible impacts of engagement activities. These impacts could include social, economic, environmental impacts, etc. We also argued for using engagement as a source of dissemination through different forms of publications or a possible source of funding. This is fairly similar to what we recommended for practice recognition. Yet again, here, as I mentioned, we did believe that in the case of engagement, there is a case to be made for the scholarship of engagement. And we argued that more effort is needed in order to recognize the engagement activity itself, or at least some of those activities, as a form of scholarship, and to accurately capture the positive impact that they have on our communities. The second part of our white paper addressed how the research, scholarship, and creative activities of architecture faculty are assessed in US schools of architecture. Here, we relied on a review of tenure and promotion guidelines in schools of architecture and in the universities that they are located in. So we looked at both university level guidelines and college and school level guidelines. We solicited these guidelines from colleagues in all of these schools. As with all surveys, we did not get 100% response, but we still heard back from about 60% of them, almost 80 schools, 79 schools to be accurate, which we believe is a good response rate and a good basis to make some generalizations and conclusions. So to analyze that information, we chose to divide schools of architecture into categories based on the classification, the Carnegie classifications of institutions of higher education. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Carnegie classification, this is the main classification used by US institutions. It is developed by a third independent party, the Carnegie Foundation, and it classifies universities based on different criteria. The basic, their main classification, they call it the basic classification, categorizes universities based on the categories that you see before you here. So the top three are doctoral universities, and within that, these are divided into doctoral universities with very high research activities. These are typically described as R1 universities. Doctoral universities with high research activities are R2, and then other doctoral universities. Then you have three categories at the master's level as well: baccalaureate universities, special focus institutions. There are also a couple of smaller categories that we didn't look at. So we hypothesized that there will be a correlation between the emphasis placed by an institution on research and scholarship, as demonstrated by the Carnegie classification, that would correlate with how they assess that research and scholarship. And therefore, we can look at these categories as a basis for that. To a large extent, we found that that correlation was there in the data. We also found an interesting outcome. As you can see in this table, at the time of writing the white paper, there were 133 US schools with accredited architectural programs in the US. Almost more than 70% of them were located in R1 and R2 institutions. So more than 70% of US schools of architecture were located in institutions with high or very high research activities. So in general, we opted to look more closely at these institutions and how they addressed issues of research, scholarship, and creative activities. We found that those institutions place high importance in research as a dominant descriptor of a faculty member's responsibilities. Again, I'm sure most of you may already know that, but in general, in US institutions, faculty have three types of responsibilities: teaching, service, and then the third is described in different ways by different schools. But in R1 and R2 universities, the term research is the dominant term used to describe this third bucket, if you will, of activities or expectations from a faculty member in terms of their responsibilities. And in many schools, this roughly accounts for about 40% of the faculty members' time and or weight of evaluation. So again, research is the term used most dominantly in R1 and R2 institutions, although almost all of them continue to consider creative activities to be recognized as an alternative. So if a faculty member's primary mode of productivity is creative activities, that is certainly acceptable. With regard to assessing quality within these institutions, most of them emphasize originality as a primary criteria of quality. Many, if not most of them, identified peer-reviewed publications as the main form of dissemination that they recognized, with the quality of the publisher and or the organization hosting the event or publishing the journal or similar to that being really the essential factors. External funding, as you would expect, was also identified as a positive factor and a positive indicator of the value of the research of a faculty member. Terms such as the significance of the work, that the work demonstrates excellence, and that the work demonstrates national and international recognition were frequently used. However, they were not necessarily clearly defined. So they were left in many cases for the faculty member to make a case for in their tenure and promotion applications. So the final portion of our work, as you can see in the white paper, focused on reviewing some international models of assessing research quality. One model that we spent some time on is the UK Research Excellence Framework, REF, which probably some of you, many of you will be aware of. And as you already probably know, the latest iteration of REF model, which is REF 2021, has actually just recently been published only a few weeks ago. REF results are used to evaluate research at UK universities in all disciplines. The framework describes disciplines as units of assessment. It is also, REF is also used to determine funding to these institutions. So it does have teeth in it. It does have value to the universities. What we like about REF is that it has been around for some time. So I think that I've heard about it in the mid to late 90s. So almost close to 30 years now, maybe. There also is a framework that goes through really rigorous evaluation and development from one round to the next. It is not an annual process. It takes a few years to do every round. The previous iteration to REF 2021 was actually 2014. So again, because of that, because of the process through which the framework is developed, evaluated, improved, we felt that it was worth including in our white paper and probably worth spending a few minutes on in this presentation as well. For the 2021 round, the assessment of research was generally made based on three criteria: the quality of the outputs, the impact of those outputs beyond academia, and the environments that support research. The definition, there were general definitions of each of these criteria, but there were also slight differences in the definitions of the criteria between the different units of assessments, between disciplines, yet in general, they all fall within the same overarching definitions. So to focus a bit more on architecture as part of REF, again, REF consisted of 34 units of assessment. Unit of assessment 16 was architecture, built environment, and planning. So that's the one that we will focus on. Again, the definition offered by REF for UA16 is a fairly broad one, as you can see. It includes a wide range of topics, of scales, and of approaches. This certainly reflects what we talked about at the beginning of this lecture regarding the complexities and challenges offered by architectural research. Note, however, the specific emphasis that REF places on research that spans disciplinary and methodological boundaries. I think this is a very important point to make about perhaps the future direction of architectural research. So with regard to assessment criteria within UAA 16, within Unit of Assessment 16, again, the same three criteria were used: output, impact, and environment. The definitions, again, slightly varied. So we'll focus on how output and impact were defined within UAA 16. The third, environment, is somewhat specific to the context of UK universities and therefore probably less useful to us here. So if we talked about output, REF is consistent with previous findings from US institutions and from our review of other disciplines. Primary emphasis is on originality. REF is open to a wide range of publications and modes of production, including digital artifacts, temporary artifacts, physical artifacts. But again, originality is the primary criteria that is used in the assessment. Assessment also is based on significance, which UA16 defines relatively broadly as a contribution to the development of the field, and or rigor, which is again defined broadly in terms of the precision, robustness of concepts, of theories, and of methodologies. So again, the criteria of assessing outputs within REF in relation to UOA 16 are originality, significance, and rigor. If we look at impact, and again, how is it addressed within UOA 16, in general, REF defines impact fairly broadly. It has to be beyond academia, but other than that, as you can see, is defined as the effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, to society, to culture, to public policy, to health, to services, to the environment, the quality of life. So a very wide range of possible impacts. They do, however, have to be impacts demonstrated beyond academia. If we focus more specifically on impacts identified as part of UOA 16, Architecture, Built Environment, and Planning, you'll see that this unit of assessment identified fairly specific categories of impacts that could be demonstrated. These were not meant to be an exhaustive list, but they included impact on creativity, economic or commercial or organizational impacts, environmental impacts, health and welfare impacts, professional impacts, and public policy impacts. Still a fairly wide range of possible impacts. The unit of assessment also identified how these impacts can be assessed, and the assessment was based on reach and on significance. In addition to REF, we looked at a couple of other European organizations as examples. So we looked at the European Union Research Framework Program. So this program aims to encourage the highest quality of research in Europe through competitive funding. So the criteria that this framework offers are actually used to evaluate and to award funding to institutions and teams of researchers. And we are talking about, in some cases, substantial amounts of funding. So it does have a large impact on forming research directions. And again, the criteria that this framework uses to evaluate funding proposals, and I have to clarify that these are not specific to architecture. These are general criteria that apply to all proposals to this program. These criteria include being bold and inspirational with wide societal relevance. They include having measurable and targeted directions, having ambitious yet at the same time realistic goals and actions, being cross-disciplinary and cross-sectoral, and offering added value. So many of those are in line with criteria that we've seen before in US institutions and in the REF. The last organization that we looked at, which is a bit more specific to architecture, is the European Association of Architectural Education, the EAAE. They have developed, a few years back, they have developed a research charter that addresses architectural research. That charter defines architectural research as original investigation to generate knowledge, insights, and understanding based on competencies, methods, and tools proper to the discipline of architecture. So again, a fairly broadly defined set of criteria to distinguish research from other activities, but you can still see the notion of originality, which comes out strongly in several other frameworks and approaches as well. EAE also developed a number of criteria to evaluate, which they proposed to evaluate research quality. These include relevance to practice, contribution to the knowledge base, making research processes and foundations explicit, and clearly communicating the methods, the context, the process, and the results, and submitting those to regular peer review. So again, the concepts of originality, of rigor, and of peer review come out strongly as major assessment criteria, which again is well in line with US institutions and other frameworks. So to conclude my talk to you today, I wanted to share with you some of the findings of our white paper, specifically in terms of the challenges we identified as needing to be addressed. All of those obviously were written in the context of North American institutions, US institutions in particular, but probably also Canadian institutions. However, I think some may have a larger relevance and could be useful in other contexts as well, including your context here today. So the first challenge we identified was the lack of a uniform disciplinary standard or set of standards for assessing the quality of architectural research, scholarship, and creative activity. So our white paper was actually meant to be a step in that direction, and hopefully it was useful to some colleagues in other schools. However, there's certainly a strong need for more work in this area. I personally believe having such disciplinary norms, disciplinary standards can help a lot, can help our institutions, can help our faculty, can help our discipline at large. However, these standards must be flexible enough to accommodate the diversity of faculty areas of expertise and modes of production that are found in most all of our schools of architecture. Another challenge we identified is the need, and I think I had mentioned that before, the need for more rigorous high quality dissemination outlets for architectural researchers. There's certainly fewer such outlets in architecture compared to other disciplines. Similarly, a similar need exists for more architecture-specific funding sources in different levels. Again, we have far fewer of those than many other disciplines. In both areas, really, the difference between us, the architecture discipline in the US, and other disciplines is substantial and needs to be addressed. Another challenge that was identified in the white paper is the need to develop assessment methods that capture some non-traditional modes of production. These can include creative work, architectural practice, and here impact was having some form of method to capture impact was thought to be a good direction to move in. And in general, having recognized and accepted methods of evaluation, especially evaluating this impact, can be very helpful. However, again, as I mentioned before, these methods, whatever they may be, should strive for objectivity and should avoid in-group bias. So with that, I will conclude my talk to you today. Thank you very much for having me join you. I do hope that this talk gave you some topics to think about, some topics to consider in the subsequent parts of your symposium. I will, of course, be very happy to answer any questions you may have by email. Again, thank you very much for inviting me, and very best wishes to you.